Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We're going to learn about the Ex Libris Identity Service. The presenter this afternoon is Josh Wiseman, our VP of Development from Resources Management Division. If you have questions as we go along, please use the functions, the Q&A or chat functions to relay those questions to us, and I'll present them to Josh at the end of his presentation. So Josh, thank you. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. Appreciate you taking the time out to learn about the Ex Libris Identity Service. So our agenda for this afternoon is to talk a little bit about existing authentication methods, review what we have currently available today. Those methods will not change, but we do want to make sure that everyone's aware of the different options that you have before you. Then afterwards, we'll talk about the identity service itself, a little bit of the background, why we decided to invest and launch such a service, and what it means to you as a customer. Then we'll talk about the migration, how exactly we'll move from the internally stored passwords that we have today to the identity service. And then finally, we'll talk about next steps, how you can prepare for the migration and for the launch of the identity service. So let's start off with talking about existing authentication methods. So today we support a number of different ways to authenticate. For many, if not most institutions who have some kind of identity provider for the entire institution, so you know that we can support today single sign-on methods like SAML or CAS. Those allow you to log on once and then be automatically logged on to a number of different applications. And we also support LDAP, which allows Alma or Primo or Summon over Alma. I'll talk about those things in terms of discovery. We allow those to present a username and password field, and then you can type in username and password, and you're authenticated against an LDAP, which is some kind of Active Directory or other store of users for the institution. So those are what we call institutional identity providers, and that's the preferred method of handling authentication. And for most customers, that is indeed what they do. Now, there are a number of different scenarios that are not covered by the institutional identity providers. There are some institutions who provide service to community borrowers or to walk-in users or who are legally obligated to provide library services to a wide number of citizens. And therefore, we need ways to authenticate those users as well. They would not be located in any kind of institutional identity provider. And then we have, although it's a small number, we do have authentication. We do have institutions that have no means of authentication at all, no institutional identity provider that can offer authentication services. And so our goal here is to be able to provide enough features to cover as many of those use cases as possible. So the institutional identity providers we talked about, we know more or less how those work, the SAML and CAS and LDAP. I want to talk a little bit more in depth about these kind of relatively new options of social login and sign-in with email. So let's talk about social login first. So as I mentioned, there is a use case in which some institutions have to provide services to community borrowers who are not registered in the institutional identity provider, or for graduates of the institution, or perhaps even for the general public. And so it's not feasible to authenticate those users via some kind of institutional repository. And so therefore, we offer this social login. So it avoids the need for the user to remember an additional username and password. Okay, so we don't have to keep track of a new user account and another password. And for those institutions who choose to offer this, it's important to note that no information is shared between Alma and the social provider. So of course, in today's climate and environment, we're all concerned about privacy, and rightly so. So it's important to note that no information is shared between Alma and the social provider. We use it purely for authentication. The social network provides Alma with the public information, just the name and the email address, and Alma does not share any information back to the social networks. That's important to know. And another note is that for those institutions who wish to offer self-registration, again, when they offer services to the general public, or when they want to provide services for community borrowers. So one option is to allow those users to come into the library, to the institution, and to ask a librarian at a circulation desk to create an account for them. Alternatively, you can enable self-registration, which means that, again, as an option, if a user logs on to Discovery with not having an account inside of Alma, then we'll recognize that and we'll offer to create an account on the fly for that user. So that's what we call self-registration. It's available as an option. Okay, so all of this is available today. It's available by configuration. Each institution can decide which social networks they wish to allow their users to authenticate with. So here, for example, we see a screen where the user is prompted with a number of choices. Well, email we'll talk about in a moment, but here we see that this institution has configured Facebook and Google and Twitter as the options. Okay, and again, as I mentioned, you can configure some or all of those options. And so when the user clicks on that link, they're brought to their social network account. They log in. And if it's the first time that the user is interacting with Alma, with that particular library, they'll give permission for that social network to share the public profile information with the library. And then that's it. The account will be associated with their account in Alma, and from then on they can use the social logon to authenticate. And as I mentioned, there is an option here for self-registration, and that's what the little screenshot on the right shows. So you can see we've recognized that the user who is currently logged into the social network does not have an account in the library, and we offer to provision an account for them on the fly. So that's on the right-hand side. So for those who are interested in this option, there's of course documentation on the developer network and also on the online help for how to configure this. There is some configuration which needs to be done inside each social network that you want to allow your users to authenticate with. And there's some configuration to be done inside of Alma. And then in order to allow users this feature, so you can actually use the Alma interface to send out an invitation email, either to an individual user or to a set of users that you can define. And that invitation email will say something to the effect of, we've decided to allow your user to log in with a social network. Click on this link to attach or to associate your library account with a social network account or profile. And that magic link will allow the user to go through the process of authenticating with the social network, and then from that point on, they can use that social network to log on. Okay. So again, for new users, you can use the Alma interface to create an internal user and then send them a social network authentication invitation email right there on the spot. Okay. So this is an interesting option. There are many institutions who are using this today in production. Usually it's used in conjunction with other options. So as I mentioned, if you have an institutional identity provider, but you have additional users who cannot be authenticated by that provider, you can use this as an option. So that's social login. And sign-in via email is actually similar. It works in a similar way. So it's an alternative to social login for those who want to offer it, again, in addition to or instead of logging in via social network. It can be used for any user who has an email address. So any user who has an email address in the system. There's no kind of pre-registration or pre-configuration that has to be done for the user. Once you go into Alma and you enable this as a login option, then any user who has an email can use it to log in. It's available both for discovery, okay, for Primo and Primo V, and also Summon over Alma, and it's available for Alma for staff users as well. Okay, so the way this works is that a user is registered in Alma with an email address via one of the normal methods, either via the circulation desk or REST API or whatever method you use to create an internal user inside of Alma. And then when the user wishes to log on to Discovery, they'll select the login via email option, and they'll put in their registered email address. Okay, then we display a message saying, hey, we've sent you an email. All right, and then the user can go to their email box and they get an email with a magic link, and that magic link is good for a certain period of time. For a short period of time, the user can click on that magic link and they're automatically logged into Discovery. There's no password required. That's why we call it the magic link. And of course, that link is cryptographically signed. It just means that we provide that link in a way that it can't be spoofed or you can't log in as someone else. Okay, so again, it's a similar use case as social for people who can't be authenticated via one of the standard authentication methods. On the Pro side, there's no required setup for any individual user. Any user with an email address can use it. There's no required setup with any social network. Okay, of course, the downside is that the user has to go into their email in order to be able to log in to retrieve that email. But we know that this is a method of authentication which is used in many sites today. Okay, so that is about signing in with email. So again, we've spoken about the regular institutional identity providers. We've spoken about those users for whom using the institutional identity provider is not an option. And we have those additional options of social login or email. Now, we do understand that there are some use cases for some institutions for whom none of those options is appropriate, and they wish to be able to allow users to authenticate with a username and password, but still manage those users inside of Alma. So let's talk about a little bit of terminology first. So internal users are users that are created and managed inside of Alma. Okay, there's no SIS system, there's no student information system, there's no synchronization process with an external system. Those users are managed internally to Alma. Okay, and so until now, we've also allowed the option to authenticate, meaning those users also have a password, can have a password associated with them. And our concern as a provider of cloud software for higher education is to adhere to the highest levels of security for our customers. It's something that we're increasingly even more concerned with, given all of the news in the past couple of years and really continuing until the past couple of weeks of various high-profile breaches, even to the most sophisticated companies. And so the fact that we are holding on to user passwords for your users is something that we take very seriously. And so we want to make sure that we're adhering to the highest levels of security for that information, for those passwords. On the other hand, we understand that you as our customers expect a certain level of service from our applications, and you expect the feature to be able to store a password inside of Ex Libris applications and allow users to authenticate with that password. So for that reason, we have decided to launch this identity service, the Ex Libris Identity Service. And the goal is to, at the same time, maintain the level of service that you've come to expect, but also to adhere to industry standards and security best practices. So we will continue to support internal users and internal authentication. So you'll be able to continue to manage users inside of Alma and also to continue to put passwords on those users inside of Alma. Okay? The difference is that until now, those passwords for internally authenticated users were stored inside of Alma along with the user's record. All right, and Alma is a state-of-the-art, next-generation library management system, but of course, it is not first and foremost a user management system. And so going forward, we will store internal users' passwords in the Ex Libris identity service. So what is this identity service? Well, we've gone and we have installed in all of our data centers a commercial best-of-breed identity provider application. And we're going to host that application with all of the cloud responsibilities that come along with it. So disaster recovery and high availability and backup and maintenance and patches, etc. So we're taking that responsibility on ourselves. Okay? And so now when you come to store a password for a user, you'll use the same screens or the same methods that you did until now. The difference is instead of that password being stored inside of Alma along with the user record, we're actually going to store that password in the identity provider, the Ex Libris Identity Service. Okay, so that will give you the ability to still maintain that level of service, but will increase the level of security by storing the passwords in a best-of-breed system according to the highest standards of security today. So a few clarifications. So first of all, this only affects internal users who have passwords. Okay, so there's all sorts of flavors of users. There's external users who are maintained in other systems and are also authenticated in other systems. There are internal users that can be authenticated with other means, like social login or login via email that we just saw a few minutes ago. So this only affects users who are managed internally to Alma and who have passwords stored along with those users. And the other point of clarification I want to make is that all the authentication flows, the various authentication flows that institutions might have been updated to use the identity service. So of course within Alma itself for staff users, also Primo and all the variations, old authentication, new authentication, Primo V, for those Primo instances that use PDS, summon over Alma, so all of the various discovery services have been updated to use and to interoperate with the Ex Libris Identity Service. And also the authentication APIs, which can be used to authenticate users with passwords stored inside of Alma for broker systems, resource sharing scenarios, those library scenarios we've supported until now, those will continue to be supported with the identity service. So there's a REST API for authentication, there's authentication options for NSIP and for SIP2. So those can continue to be used. Again, Ex Libris is not in the business of being an identity provider. There are other companies who do that as their core competency. And so that's not the business that we're in. But for those scenarios, those library workflows that require authentication for users who have passwords inside of Alma or inside of the Ex Libris Identity Service, we'll continue to support those options. Okay, so there are two flavors of or levels of the identity service. So the standard service is included in the regular Alma subscription fee. There's no additional charge. And that allows an institution to authenticate up to 5,000 internal users. Now we understand that standard service covers, we did some research to look at, covers the overwhelming majority of customers. So the overwhelming majority of institutions have some kind of combination of authentication services. They have an institutional identity provider, okay, which covers most patrons, and then they have leftovers that need to be managed. And so that number of 5,000 handles the overwhelming majority of institutions. Okay. Now there are some institutions who, for one reason or another, do not have any kind of institutional identity provider and have a large number of users who they need to authenticate. And so for them, we offer a premium service, which is an optional cost offering. It allows you to authenticate an unlimited number of users. Okay, so this again is meant to provide an option for those institutions that have no identity management, identity providers for the institution, and need to authenticate all of their users or a large number of users via internally managed passwords. Okay, and here we'll note that as part of the migration to the identity service, so any Ex Libris customer, any Alma customer who signed their contract before June 30th, 2018, has already received the premium service at no additional fee. Okay, and that's to ease the migration to this new service. So again, any customers who signed their contract before June 30th have received or will receive the premium service at no additional fee. After that point, there are the two flavors, standard and premium. Okay, so now we know what the identity service is, let's talk about migration. How are we planning on moving to this a new identity service? So the migration is intended to be as transparent as possible for institutions and for patrons. Okay, we're trying to make the process as easy as possible. So the service will be officially launched for general availability in the January 2019 release, so coming up now in about 2.5 months. And I'll note here that we have been working with a number of pilot customers. Okay, so since August, we've been working with a number of customers of various different flavors, of all different discovery flavors. I mentioned before PDS and Primo V and some went over Alma and New Auth and Old Auth. And so we've initiated a pilot program with a number of those customers. And so this has been in testing now for several months. And so we're now ready for production for general availability, which is scheduled for January of 2019. Okay, so once the service is released, along with the January release, the first time a user logs into Discovery or into Alma, the user's password will automatically be migrated out of Alma and into the identity service. So a user comes to the login screen, they put in their password, we see that the password is valid, we move it out of Alma and into the identity service. Okay. Now, until now, each institution has been able to specify a password strength policy for their own institution. And there are varying password strength policies throughout all of our institutions, some of which have been quite lenient, okay, specifically allowing rather short passwords. And so we will, as a part of this migration to the identity service, will be moving to a single unified password strength policy. And so for those patrons or those users whose passwords did not meet the unified password strength policy, so they'll be prompted with a screen at that point to change their password as a part of that first login to Alma or to Discovery. And then once they change their password, their new password will be stored in the identity service. Okay, so for a large number of users, it'll be completely transparent. They'll log in, their password will be migrated, and they won't have any idea that anything happened. For those users who have a short password or password which does not meet the requirements, they'll be prompted on the spot to provide a new password. Okay, so what is this unified password strength policy? So we've decided on a policy which is based on the latest industry standards from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. In the past couple of months while we were developing this service, NIST came out with their latest password strength recommendations. And the stress there is on, the emphasis is on length rather than complexity. So we're going to require an 8-character password, which is significantly longer than many institutions have done until now, but without complexity rules. So the longer the password is, the easier it is to remember, the harder it is to guess. Okay? They'll be able to use passphrases or passwords as long as it's a minimum of 8 characters. Okay, so we're going to have a migration period of a year from January 2019 release through to the end of December 2019. And all throughout that period, any users who log in during that time, their passwords will be migrated to the identity service. So now what happens if we have users who for some reason went away or fell asleep, or for whatever reason they did not log in to Discovery or to Alma for that whole entire migration period? And they come back and they wake up on January 2nd, 2020, and they try to log in to Alma. So at the end of the migration period, we're going to remove all of the passwords which were not migrated. We're going to remove them from Alma. Okay. This is actually a good opportunity for institutions to purge. I can tell you there are millions, literally, of passwords currently stored inside of Alma, and only a small percentage of those are in actual use. So this process will allow us, and for your good as well, to purge all of those passwords which are not in use. So if that user wakes up on January 2nd, 2020 and wants to log in, he will not have a password in Alma anymore. So there's two options for those types of users. Again, we expect that to be a relatively unusual case, but there'll be a forgot my password link within Alma or available from Discovery. User can click on that. They can put in their username or their email address, and Alma will send a reset email to that email address. So the user will be able to do self-service and reset their own password. Alternatively, the user password can also be reset by a staff user. So the staff user can go into the same Alma user interface, and they can put a password in Alma, and they can save it for that user. A third option, or 2A, is to be able to go into the staff interface and send the user a reset password email directly from the Alma staff user interface. Okay, so this is actually a new feature which is available, which for some institutions was not available before, and that is that from Discovery, you can provide an option for users who forgot their password. They can have the self-service password reset, and that's of course only for users who have passwords managed inside of Alma or inside of the Libris Identity Service. Of course, we're not going to go and update their password in LDAP or whatever institutional identity provider they might be using. Okay, so let's see some of these processes that I just mentioned. Let's see some of them on screenshots here. So I mentioned the migration of existing users to the identity service. So how does that work? So as I said, if the password meets the password strength complexity requirements, it'll be transparent for the user. And if not, then the user will receive a screen that says, please enter your current password and a new password. And the new passwords need to be at least 8 characters long. So that's the screen that they'll see. And then once they put in a new password, we'll go ahead and store that in the identity service. And from that point on, the user will authenticate against the identity service. Okay, if a staff user wishes to send a user or a patron a reset password email, they can go into the user record. They can click on identity service email. An email will be sent to the user with a change your password link, and that change your password link will take them to a password screen. The same process happens from the forgot my password link within Discovery. As I say here, forgot your password, you can add a forgot password link to Primo or to Discovery, and that will allow patrons to change their passwords, again, if they're internally managed inside of Alma. Okay, so those are some of the screens that will be used as a part of the migration to this process, and also afterwards, even after we've moved to the identity service. As I said, you'll be able to allow users to reset their passwords in a much more self-service manner. Okay, so we've talked about the identity service provider, why we decided to invest and implement the identity service inside of the Libris Cloud, what that offers you, how we're going to migrate, and now I want to talk a little bit about next steps. What should you do between now and the January release in order to prepare for the migration to the identity service? So as I said, with the January 2019 release, the Libris Identity Service will be activated for all institutions, and the migration process will begin. That'll begin the countdown for the year-long migration window, during which passwords will be migrated whenever a user logs in. Okay, so as you saw in the previous slides, there are some new screens. that you may wish to customize in terms of the message. So the colors and the logo will, of course, come from your own customizations inside of Alma, but you also have the option of customizing the text to make sure that it fits in with the language or terminology that you use inside of your institution. So you don't have to do anything, but if you want to, you can optionally choose to customize the labels on those screens and those emails. And I'll point out here again, some users will never see those screens because their passwords are long enough. They'll be transparently migrated to the service. So this is only for users who will have to change their password as a part of logging in. Okay, so starting now from the November release, which is on the sandbox this weekend and in production in 2 weeks, the labels for those screens can be customized using the login messages code table, and there's a path to where that code table is located, and you can go ahead and customize those labels. And as we saw, we have the option here of sending a forgot password email or a reset password email, and so you'll want to customize that email as you have done for your other emails using the same methodology, the XSLs. And so there's the name, excuse me, of the XSL that you can use to customize the email which is sent out to reset your password. Okay, so again, if you do nothing, it's fine with a January release. The identity service will be activated. User password will start to be migrated as they log in. Nothing, you don't have to do anything. Optionally, if you'd like to, you can take this opportunity leading up to that release to customize some of the labels and emails that will go out as a part of this migration to the identity service. Okay, so there is a rather lengthy FAQ available on the developer network, and here's a quick short link to it. You can also just go ahead and Google the Libris Identity Service, and that'll take you right there as well. So there's a number of questions and answers. Most of the information we reviewed today, but if you still have questions, happy to take those questions, or you're happy to look at those questions and see if they're addressed on the FAQ, in addition, of course, to the questions that you're welcome to ask in the coming minutes, which I'll be glad to try to answer. But this is a short link to the Identity Service FAQ, and there we have a compiled list of questions which we've received from the field as a part of the pilot program, and so there we provide quite a bit of information. So you're welcome to use that link to get there. Okay, so I'm going to pause now. There's been a few questions in the Q&A. As you've seen the slides and heard what we had to say, if other questions have come to mind, please feel free to put them into the Q&A, and we will be happy to try to address them here. Okay, so I'm going to back up and see what some of the questions have been as we went along. So there's a question about the magic link, which is sent to users to log in. It is not customizable. The presentation says 30 minutes, screenshot says 1 hour. I believe it's 1 hour. I can double check that, but it's somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, and it's not customizable. Basically, if the link, it's meant to be used immediately, and if the link expires for some reason, then they can just go ahead and click on sign in via email again and have the email resent. So that's not a problem. There's a question about admin logons into Alma. So any account that has a password, that has passwords stored inside of Alma, any of those accounts will be migrated, any of those passwords will be migrated to the identity service. So any passwords inside of Alma, once you use it to log in the first time, those will be migrated to the identity service. Okay, there's a question about internal users with sandbox environments. So we also have configured the identity service for all of our sandbox environments as well. Of course, there's different users, so you'll have to, so we'll store different passwords for different users. They're considered different user records inside of sandbox and inside of production, but those passwords are stored in the identity service as well. Again, our goal is to make sure that Alma itself is not managing any passwords, whether it's sandbox or production. Okay, the question of if passwords expire. Passwords themselves do not expire. There are a number of ways that passwords are removed from the identity service. So first of all, if you go into the user record and empty or clear out the password, it will be removed from the identity service and the user will not be able to log in. And whenever a user is deleted or deactivated or purged from the system, then the passwords are removed from the identity service as well. Okay, the only thing that we're storing, the only information that's being stored in the identity service is the password. So there's no personal information. So from the point of view of GDPR and privacy, there is no personally identifiable information stored in the identity service. There is only the password and a synthetic key, and that is removed whenever the user record is removed from Alma. Okay, so continuing along with some of the questions that we've received. So again, just to clarify, there's a question about SAML. So any users that are authenticated externally who don't have a password stored inside of Alma, this will not affect them. This only affects users who have passwords stored in Alma. So anybody who uses, if you use your own SAML with your own institutional logon page, this does not affect those users at all. There's a question about charging existing Alma customers in the future for the service. So all existing Alma customers or all Alma customers who sign their contract before June 30th, 2018, they have been given or grandfathered into the premium service, and so there will be no charge. There are no plans to go back and retroactively charge those customers. They will have the premium service due to the fact that they're grandfathered in. Okay, there's a question here about Primo and Aleph or Voyager. And so this only affects passwords that were stored in Alma. Okay, and again, that's because we are concerned or don't wish to have the responsibility or we take the responsibility seriously of maintaining your users' passwords in our cloud, especially in our SaaS software. And so this only affects users whose passwords were stored inside of Alma. Those passwords will be migrated to the identity service. It doesn't affect Aleph, even if Aleph is hosted by Libris. Okay, there's a question about if this is a competitive differentiator, if we know what our competitors do in this regard. We do not intend, we're not addressing this from a commercial perspective. This whole effort was the result of a long process that we've gone through with the user groups, with a authentication focus group that was established about 2 years ago with Igloo and Eluna. And it was, an effort to determine what the best way was to adhere to industry standards and best practices and the highest level of security possible, while maintaining the level of service that we've obligated ourselves to for our customers. This wasn't meant to be, this wasn't a commercial consideration, and that's why even the standard service has a relatively high number of users. There is a cost involved for us of maintaining the identity service, of course, and backups and operations, etc. But it's a very, very important topic to us. As I said before, we take the security of your data very seriously, and so it's important to us to try to provide the highest level of security if you're entrusting us to maintain passwords for your users. There's a question about custom web forms or custom user registration processes with APIs. So you can continue to use the same APIs, the REST API that you've used until now, and the REST API has been modified that if you create a user and send a password, the same API will create the password and put it in the identity service. Okay, so you don't have to make any changes on your side. The API has been updated to store the password instead of in Alma in the identity service. So nothing needs to be done there. The password is a question about what characters are acceptable for passwords. Any characters are acceptable for passwords as long as it is at least 8 digits. There are a number of exclusions. There's quite a long list of common passwords that we've excluded, again, as a part of an industry best practice. So you can't do 1 through 8, for example. You can't do 8 times 0. A lot of these kind of blacklist passwords we do not allow, but any passphrase or password is acceptable according to the password strength requirements. And then there's a question about whether or not we can use the identity service to authenticate to other service providers, like with SAML. So it's not our intention to become an identity provider. We do not want to become, for example, a SAML identity provider. Okay, we interact with SAML as a service provider, as an application, not as a store of user passwords. And it's not we are not interested in getting into that business. As I said, there are dedicated services, and that's what they do for a living. This identity service is meant to fill the gap and to allow customers who have no other choice to put passwords in Alma, but it's not meant to be an identity provider for the entire institution. I will say, as I mentioned before, we do support the authentication services that we've supported until now. Those are meant specifically for library-based workflows, like resource sharing, ILL, broker services. So you still can authenticate against user passwords in the identity service using REST API, using NSIP, using SIP2. But it's not our intention to make that, to widen that and allow it to be used for any service to authenticate. Okay, there's a question about the reset password link on Discovery. So there's a reset password link which will be added to the Alma login screens. But for Discovery, we're not adding it automatically. And the reason is because each institution defines their users a little bit differently. They call their users by different things. Some users are sometimes you've got users who, in the majority of cases, you have users who are authenticated with the institutional identity provider, and then only a subset of them are internally managed passwords inside of Alma. And so we're leaving it up to the institutions to use the Discovery customization features to use the right language, the appropriate language for that institution. And so you can, whatever you call those types of users, you can make it clear that that only those types of users can click on the reset password link from the logon page. But again, because there is such a wide variety of use cases there, we'll let each institution customize that and add a link themselves. Okay, so you've asked some great questions. I'm just taking a look here if there's anything that I missed. There was a question about plain text credentials. So we've never stored plain text credentials. Today, passwords are, even in Alma, they are hashed and salted, and so we never have plain text credentials. But this move to the identity service will allow us to store those passwords in a system for which its sole purpose is to handle password security. So it's no longer something that we're developing as Libris, but we are using an industry standard tool. And so even though, again, until now we were never storing plain text passwords, we're confident in the security that this dedicated tool will provide to us.
Yes, I don't see any other questions. I guess we can wait just 1 or 2 minutes just in case anybody has any final questions. You received a lot, did a great job of answering them. So thank you for that. We'll just wait 1 or 2 more minutes and see if anything else comes up.
So someone has asked a question about whether, just to clarify, that you can still use the Alma user interface, the Alma user management screens, and that is correct. From a staff user perspective, they can still go into an internal user, They can modify the password. Of course, you can't see the password inside that screen, but you can modify it, and that modified password will be saved to the identity service. So that's transparent from the point of view of a staff user. And then there's a question about if a user who was previously managed externally, like in some kind of institutional identity provider, and they become internal. So in many institutions, for example, when a class graduates, those users are moved to internal users, and they can continue to get services from the library. So in that case, you can use some of the tools to send them an email, which allows them to set a password for themselves, or they can use the forgot password link to reset their password themselves. So again, for those users, we will not create a password for them automatically. You can, as a group, as a set of users, you can send them all an email which says, hey, you can go ahead and set yourselves a new password using this link, or if they don't do it at that point, they can do it later, either via the forgot password link or via a librarian. So
Josh, there is another question. I think I know the answer, and it's no. But the question is it possible for us to set the password length as longer than 8 characters?
No, you're correct. The answer is no. We have a unified password strength policy for everyone using the identity service.
Thank you. So I don't see any other questions. We have many, many people in the session this afternoon. So Josh, I would like to thank you for the preparation and also for your presentation. I'll remind you that there is the FAQ available on the developer network. And as Josh said, searching for Ex Libris Identity Service will be a very effective way of taking you directly to that. And I'll also let you know that there will be a recording of this webinar, which we will circulate in due course as well. So this will be available if you want to listen to it again. Josh, once again, thank you very much for your effort. To everybody else, thank you very much for joining and for your time. Let me wish you a successful rest of the day and week and good weekend. Thank you.